This is Billy Kay with the Complete Caledonian Imbiber, which celebrates the Scots drouth for ale, whisky and the great historic wines of Europe such as Sherry and Madeira. My archive programme from 1994 with music by Rod Patterson and John Martin and readings by Peter Raffin. Episode 4, Bend Weel to the Madeira.
There was a substantial amount of disagreement with the French at the time, and so the wine merchants of Great Britain were looking for alternative sources. What's curious is that most of the wine suppliers who went abroad were actually either from Scotland or from Ireland and not English, but they were supplying England. And the peninsula became a good source of wine. But it sort of all came down at the end to concentrating on port and on sherry, which is what the company now sells.
Recruiting sergeants come fae the Black Watch. They come to a firm, some recruits for to catch, but all they enlisted was 40 and twa. Say list my bonny laddie and come awa, and it's over the mountains and over the main, through Gibraltar to France and Spain. We have feather to your bonnet and the kilt upon your knee, and list my bonny laddie and come awa with me.
A Scots song from the Peninsular War and George Sandeman from Jerez handling the Complete Caledonian Imbiber. If it was soldiers returning from that war in the early 19th century which established firmly the popularity of sherry and Madeira, it was often Jacobite exiles from previous conflicts who shipped the wine home. In Madeira, for example, the Gordons have an impeccable Jacobite pedigree.
Russell Manners Gordon, already referred to as the third Viscount and the first Count de Torabella by marriage, was the third grandson of the celebrated Lord Kenmure, who was beheaded in the Tower of London on the 24th of February 1716 by order of George I for his part in the Stuart uprising against the throne of England.
Another branch of the Gordons, established in the sherry trade in 1770, were also Jacobites and Banffshire Catholics who gave support to the Scots Catholic College in Spain. Their bodega was a haven for travellers from home. Geordie Gordon, Lord Byron, visited in 1809.
At Jerez, where the sherry we drink is made, I met a great merchant, a Mr. Gordon of Scotland, who was extremely polite and favoured me with the inspection of his vaults and cellars, so that I quaffed at the fountain head.
Wine from the area around Jerez and Cadiz has been brought to Scotland since the 16th century. Called sack from the Spanish word seco, dry, it came along with Mountain, Malaga, Malmsey and the rather less mellifluous sounding Bastardo. These were being shipped by an Ayrshireman, James Duff, and his nephew William Gordon, home to Oliphants of Ayr from 1767 onwards. The Osborne family, which owns the Duff Gordon label today, know the story of the firm's founders, but their countrymen have always had a problem with their names.
El fundador de Duff Gordon fue Jones que nació en Asbury, Escocia.
Somebody suggested that you didn't use the name Duff Gordon in Spain because no one could pronounce it correctly.
Yes, completely right. Because in Spain they used to say Duff Gordon. Duff Gordon. And that is the reason that in the old time they decide Duff Gordon for export and the Osborne for the home market.
Gabrielle Osborne. In Jerez, I discovered that not only companies have names adapted to be compatible with Spanish and Scots culture. James Ferguson and his daughter Macarena.
The Christian name Macarena is a very typical one from Sevilla. That's where my mother is. And then Ferguson, of course, comes from my father's side. Great-grandfather was the one who came over from Scotland and married a Heritana.
Officially, I am James Ferguson. I am called Diego in Spanish. I don't know why, because normal translation of James is Jaime, And I don't know why my grandfather was also. He came from Scotland, being James, and he was called Diego here.
Having worked in the sherry trade all his life, there was no better man to take me in among the vines on the undulating, baking land outside of Jerez.
I don't know in degrees, but centigrades is much more than 100 degrees. The problem here is that it's the influence of the wind. We have got a wind which comes from the land, which is across all Spain, and it is completely dry and hot. That dries up the grapes. But in one night that changed the wind and comes from the sea, it gets full again.
What kind of grapes are these here?
That is Palomino. Palomino fino, we call it, because it used to be in the old days another Palomino called Palomino Jerezano or Basto, which produce much more fatter wines. And this Palomino fino produce a more delicate and thin wines.
I had a fino last night with some seafood. Would this be the grape that went into the fino?
Yes, it will be, but of course more dire, that is too green still.
What does it taste like? I'm going to taste one.
Oh.
It's actually quite sweet.
You have been lucky.
Unusually for grapes that go into wine. Maybe it's the sun, but these could almost pass as dessert. As dessert grapes. Almost. Not quite.
Well, normally the Palomino is very, very sweet when it's completely ready to be making the wine.
If Sandeman and Duff Gordon are the most famous Scots names in sherry, until 1970, when it was bought by Harveys of Bristol, there existed another Scots firm, Mackenzie's, which dated back to the 1840s. In Oporto, the British formed a community apart. How did the Scots fit into Spanish society?
They actually became much more integrated, and I'm not certain. I think, Jerez is a much smaller community in itself. It's a much smaller town, and there wasn't room to have, how would you put it, a separate expatriate community living there. So I think they became much more integrated, married much more so into Spanish. In my background, my father, sounds a bit silly, but married my mother, fortunately. Otherwise I'd have a problem. Who is from Jerez, from one of the sherry families, Valdespino. And so, this was, I think, much more traditional.
In the old days, Mackenzie was quite important firm, was perhaps even the fourth or the fifth in category of shippers. I was working since I was 17 years old here in Mackenzie. My grandfather, he was born in a farm called Upper Cool of Morange in Banffside in Scotland. And he came to Jerez being shareholder of Mackenzie. And of course he married here in Jerez. And then his wife became British, and I am British too, of course, of that reason, because my father also married a Spanish and she became again British. I've been living all my life here. I was born here. And still I have to ask every 5 years for a permit for living and another permit for working.
Are your Spanish friends quite surprised when they hear that you're a British citizen?
Yes, in some way, but Jerez, that is quite normal. There is a lot of connection between British people and Jerez people. That is, of course, of the business of sherry.
Have you ever gone back to Scotland to visit where you come from?
Yes, once I went with my wife, and I spent a week in Scotland trying to find that farm, which was very difficult to find it, but at least we found it, and we enjoy it very much. The country is the most pretty country I have ever seen in my life, and the only problem there was that here in July it's so hot, and there was raining the whole week and cold, so my wife said to me, now I understand why your grandfather didn't come back to Scotland.
Should all acquaintance be forgot and never thought upon, let's hae a walk to Malaga for auld lang for auld lang syne, my jo, for auld lang syne. Let's hae a walk to Malaga for auld lang syne.
One of the early versions of Auld Lang Syne collected by Burns, referring to Malaga, another fortified peninsular wine you can still find here. Although all the peninsular wines trade on a distinctive traditional image today, at one time any marketing at all was considered bad form. Sandemans were the mould breakers.
In 1900, Sandeman had been pioneering shipping bottled wines, because prior to that, everybody had shipped wine in cask to wine merchants. And they decided that the answer here was not only to ship bottled wines, but also to ship, as a guarantee, labelled bottled wines. Then, of course, the natural thing was to tell people. In fact, when the advertising came in, it started off with newspaper advertising that said things like, buy Sandemans port, it's the best. Sort of thing that we'd have a bit of a problem advertising now, even though we believe it, of course. From then on, Sandeman became well known for newspaper and for poster advertising. This commercial artist, who was also a Scotsman actually, his name was George Massett Brown. So he turned up at the offices at St Swithin's Lane in the city with this poster of this cloaked man with a Spanish hat and a Portuguese cape. And he said, this is what you need. And at the time, my great-grandfather saw this and said, you're absolutely right, it just needs one thing, and that's at the bottom you have to put the word Sandeman Port and Sherry. And that poster, actually, the original of it is in the museum here in our lodges.
Although others slowly followed suit and Sandeman had a head start on their competitors, they were aware of the furore their revolution had caused in the conservative world of the wine trade.
I was told by a previous general manager here at Sandeman, Gwyn Jennings, was telling me that his father was general manager at the time, and the rest of the trade stopped speaking to him when Sandeman started advertising because they didn't think it was the right thing. You know, advertising was considered a very vulgar thing to do. And in fact, Walter Sandeman, when he was given the freedom of the city of Perth, at the speech he made, actually made a reference to the criticism he'd been receiving, and said that he'd been much criticised for introducing the new methods of advertising to the old vine of winemaking.
George Sandeman. One of the headiest aromas on earth is to be found in a sherry bodega. There I was to discover another Scotch connection, which is very much alive.
Where we are, is all this building is full of sweet wine.
It has a lovely, rich, buttery smell to it, hasn't it?
This is the one I said is PX, who was made with raisins. That's why that special smell. And we have got around 5,000 butts of this sweet wine, which we use, of course, for the cream sherry we sell from harvest.
The barrels themselves, the butts, how old are they? Do you like new ones or do you like old ones?
No, old ones, old ones.
Why that?
Because it's better seasoned, the wood, and doesn't give any taste from wood. For these wines, it's important, but not so important. But for the finos, it's terribly important, how seasoned and how old is the cask.
I believe in the past, you've sold some of these sherry butts to the Scotch whisky trade.
Oh, yes. Ooh. All the casks we used to ship were sold to them. And funny enough, some years ago we couldn't find here, and I bought some from Scotland and imported to here to be used again with sherry.
Did it not impart a whisky flavour to the sherry?
Well, but we seasoned again with a rough also to take out the smell and all that.
Of the whisky?
Yes.
What do the whisky manufacturers, what do they want from a sherry butt?
Well, the thing is that in the old days, we used to sell, and Mackenzie was famous as selling to Scotland, one sherry called Pajarete, who was very, very sweet and very dark, to be blended in the whisky. That was because they were allowed to use sherry butts and with some sediment of sherry in it. And what they used to do is put that sediment with that very sweet, old and dark wine, which gives character, a little bit of character to the whiskey.
I'm right on the north coast of Madeira, walking along a pebble beach, a boulder beach to be exact. The sea's crashing against the huge cliffs, but looking inland there's a défilé, and then a very tropical looking area with this beautiful carpets of vines rising up the hillside until you get too high and then it's wooded. Stunning landscape. How was the wine transported?
I think they used to transport them to Funchal, where are the exporting houses. They put them on pipes, they roll the pipes on the beach, and then, of course, they float the pipes up to the ship, where they are loaded into the ship, but going floating and pushed by ropes.
So are there any pipes of finest Malmsey underneath the sea there?
Probably yes. I don't know.
Jacques Faro da Silva of the Madeira Wine Company, showing me round the tiny parcels of land which comprise the island vineyard of Madeira. Madeira was the first Portuguese discovery, and its strategic position between Europe, Africa and the Americas made it a regular port of call for Scots merchants. The first Scot to settle there permanently was on board the very first Portuguese immigrant ship in 1424. John Drummond of Staub Hall was called João Escócio, Jock the Scot, and there are hundreds of people called Drummond and Escócio there today who are his descendants. The Scots colonists going to Darien called at Madeira for water and wine en route for Panama, and wine also brought a fifer called Francis Newton. A Jacobite, he railed against the Portuguese and the English and sent wine worldwide to the Scots diaspora.
500 pipes, Law Bruce and Company. 300 pipes, David Scott and Company. 1,250 pipes, Forbes Smith and Company.
He seemed to hustle a lot of his trade with people he had known personally in Scotland. To Patrick Coots on April 8th, 1753.
An old schoolfellow, Watty Hunter, traded here lately on his way to Jamaica.
To Waddle Cunningham on April 30th of the same year.
I'm glad to hear of your welfare and settlement in New York. I shall always be glad of the opportunity of promoting your interests.
The routes he opened to the West and East Indies, as we'll hear, had a great influence not only on the company he founded, today trading as Duff Gordon, but on Madeira wine itself.
For 12 pipes of the best old Madeira and a half butt of the finest old Malmsey on board the Belial bound to Berbice and the Clyde. A pipe of the best old Madeira on board the Cecilia bound to the West Indies and the Clyde.
Jack, we're here in the northern part of the island, near in Saint George, and we're in a vineyard. We're not only in a vineyard, we're actually under a vineyard. We're surrounded by hundreds of bunches of tiny green grapes. What variety are these?
You are under the terrace of Malmsey, and you can see they are growing here also pumpkins, they are growing potatoes, they are growing beans, they are growing lettuces. And we think that's the reason why they grow the grapes like that under these terraces.
And does this not affect the quality of the grape?
Well, in a way, yes, because you would prefer that all the strength from the land would go to the grapes, and because the other grows need water, and at this time, for instance, we wouldn't like them to watering the grapes. But anyhow, this is the tradition, this is the way how people also survive, that's their subsistence also food, what they grow underneath.
The fifer Francis Newton was a Jacobite sympathiser, and he was joined by Scots of a like mind. When Russell Manners Gordon married the Portuguese Countess Torabella, he had enough sense of history to call his firstborn James Murray Kenmure Gordon, after the Viscount Lochinver executed for his part in the 15 uprising, Mrs. Susan Selden.
Well, it's basically because my great-grandmother, who was the Countess Torabella, married a Scotsman who came out here and then founded the wine firm. So that's how it started. That's how the Scottish blood came into the Portuguese family, because she was pure Portuguese.
The Gordons passed on distinctively Scottish names to their sons and daughters, certainly in the first couple of generations. Did that remain?
Oh, yes. Yes, throughout, yes. And I think even to this day, as you know, even in the country, yes, in Madeira, I mean, especially amongst some of our tenants, we used to hear that they were being christened Flora, Angus, and names that were nothing to do with Portugal, not at all Portuguese. And certainly some of the children didn't look terribly Portuguese. You know, with this lovely auburn hair and fair complexion and blue eyes, who, obviously don't look at all Portuguese. And I suppose, way back there must have been a bit of fun and floric somewhere. Don't know how else to put it.
The heart of the wine trade in Madeira is the lovely lodge of São Francisco in the centre of Funchal, a place of pilgrimage for tourists and lovers of this remarkable wine alike. Ana Isabel Dantas.
It goes back to the 16th century because originally this was a site from the San Francisco Monastery, which was demolished in the 19th century. This part where we are now, this is really the only thing that still remains from the monastery itself. Mm-hmm. The Franciscans and the Jesuits, they were in the island since the 17th century. And of course they had vineyards. In fact, most of the vineyards in the Quinta Grande belonged to the Jesuits. And even the Franciscans, they might have wine in their cellars. So here we are.
Isabel, we've climbed up about 3 flights of stairs and we're now in the attic, really.
Yes, this is called the almond attic. In fact, we keep here some of the old vintage from the decade of 60s, which are still in cask. And we have right here in both sides wines from the decade of 90. From here, they could see the harbour, so they could see all the boats approaching the Bay of Funchal. In fact, to supply them with many pipes of Madeira wine to be sent all over in Europe, and at the time even to India, because the estouffaging process was discovered by accident.
Cossard Gordon sent some wine. It was all shipped in wood in those days, so it'd be casks of wine to a regiment stationed in India. And when the wine got there, the regiment had moved on and the wine was returned. Now, when the wine was returned, the shipper, Cossard, had a look at it to see how it had fared, and very much to his surprise, he had found that the wine improved. Now, the big question in those days was, has it improved because of the movement of the sea or because of the heat? And various artificial ways of moving the wine about in cask or heating it were tried, and they pinpointed it to the heating. And so that is the beginning of the tradition of winemaking in Madeira, where heating is an integral part of the manufacturing process. We take it up to about 40 degrees and hold it at that temperature for 3 to 4 months. And it's this heating process that gives the wine the typical tang that is characteristic of all Madeiras. And it's also, I believe, the process that makes Madeira wine such a long-lived wine.
And one which gained prestige as the 19th century wore on. Richard Blandy from one of the oldest English Madeira wine companies. In Scotland, when the effects of the temperance movement began to be felt at this time, and previously copious consumption was cut back, Principal Robertson of Edinburgh University was taken aside by an unknown guest of the old school immediately upon arrival for dinner at a Lothian mansion.
Doctor, I understand you're a brother of my good friend Peter Robertson of Edinburgh. Therefore I'll give you a piece of advice. Bend Weel to the Madeira at dinner, for here you'll get little o' it after.
And fine old Madeira is still worth bending wheel for Auld Lang Syne. The other thing to watch out for selling wine to the Scots is history and politics, especially if history is presented from an English perspective on your labels.
They got me into awful trouble once when I was doing a tasting in Edinburgh, because the new club, the Blandis Madeiras are named after 4 extant titles, and starting with the driest wine, the Cercial, that's named after the Duke of Sussex. And then we moved on on to the Verdelho, a difficult word to pronounce, and that's named after the Duke of Cambridge. And I then said to the assembled company, well, now we'll go on to the richer end of the range, the Boal. And I said, well, this wine is named after the Duke of Cumberland. And I'd hardly said that before somebody in the front row got up and said, well, Mr. Blandy, you won't be selling much of that wine north of the border. So we had to move on to the Duke of Clarence and the Malmsey pretty quickly after that.
Richard Blandy. If you ever visit Funchal, the San Francisco Lodge gives you the opportunity to taste fine vintage Madeiras by the glass, Cercials, Verdelhos, Boals and Malmseys, which can range from 20 to 100 years old. As her guest, I let Isabel Dantas choose one of her favourites, a wine over 30 years old made from the rare Tarentaise grape variety. If ever a wine deserved to be filled in a silver tassie, this was it.
If you leave a bottle from a wine like that in a closed room, you just leave and you came back 10 minutes later, so the bouquet will be all over in the room. So it is a lovely perfume, yes. Now I can understand why ladies in the British courts in the 18th century, they've used Madeira wine as a perfume.
So, how's it coming across? On the nose, a lot of fruit still. A lot of fruit, but with that burnt caramel aroma that a lot of old Madeiras have. And it goes down like the nectar of Olympus.
Yes. If you have a second taste, fica boca cheia e queima a garganta. Very slowly and burns
the throat on the way down.
Yes, all
and
the way
leaves
down.
That
Leaves
aftertaste
that
all the way down.
aftertaste, yes.
Yes, it's beautiful.
There is even a poem, quite a very nice poem about the Tarentaise grape. It says something like this in Portuguese: uvas Tarentaise, não as comas nem as dês, para vinho Deus as fez. The grapes from Tarentaise, don't eat it, don't give it, because for wine God have made it.
Bring to me a pint of wine and fill it in a silver tassie, that I may drink before I go. At service stay, my bonny lassie.